Rory's eyes shot open. His body rigid, he stared into the murky grayness that pressed in around him. He held his breath so he wouldn't make a sound. Rory's head and shoulders were propped on two puffy pillows that, at the moment, gave him no comfort at all. The room, though dim, was light enough that Rory could take in the closet door opposite the foot of his bed and his bedroom's two doorways, which faced each other from the left and the right side of his bed. The pillows blocked his peripheral vision, so he couldn't see the small blue-gray nightstand that held his little red alarm clock, with two bells that looked like little ears on top of the clock's face. Even so, Rory intuitively knew that it was just after midnight. He knew this because every night at about this time, the same thing happened. Unidentifiable noise, maybe a scrape or maybe a tap, woke him from a deep sleep. The noise woke him, and then a flash of curved metal appeared in the gap between the white folding doors that enclosed Rory's closet. Rory sucked in a sharp breath. The whoosh of it was amplified in the stillness of the darkened room. Oh no, Rory thought. They know I'm awake. He squeezed his eyes shut. Rory had turned 7 just a few months ago, although his memory of his small party, just him, his parents, and his friend Wade, with the balloons and big chocolate birthday cake he'd thought had too much icing, was so vague that it seemed like it had happened years ago instead of just weeks. However, as young as Rory was, he was old enough to know that closing his eyes wasn't a good defense against the creatures that were after him. Closed eyes weren't a force field, and they wouldn't make him invisible. If Rory wanted to survive the night, he had to know what was coming. "Open your eyes," he shouted at himself in his head. He opened his eyes. All the creatures appeared at once. Once they came into view, the creatures moved slowly. That didn't make them any less scary. Rory knew from experience that the creatures' pace wouldn't make it easier for him to get away. He was never able to avoid them, no matter how slow they were. Rory clutched his blankets and scooted up into a sitting position so that he could be poised to flee. But he didn't. Instead, he did what he always did when the monsters appeared. He froze and stared at them while his heart thumped faster and faster in his chest and cold sweat beaded on his forehead. Rory didn't want to freeze. He wanted to spring from his bed and run, but for some reason he couldn't. All he could ever do when he first saw the creatures was watch them. Something about them held him suspended, like he was caught in a web. From out of the closet, the piercingly sharp point of a pirate's hook sighed through the air as the rotting ruin of a fox-shaped creature with multiple rows of jagged teeth crept out into the room. The fox's eyes shone stark white in the surrounding darkness. Those eyes were focused directly on Rory. Rory trembled. He tried and failed to keep himself from whimpering. 2 more pairs of eyes appeared, one set each in the open gaps of the doors to the left and right of the bed. 2 more creatures were preparing to slink toward Rory's bed. Both doors opened wider. The creatures began to enter the room. The creature on the right was a decayed version of a yellow chick, its body so riddled with holes that only the barest hints of a metal skeleton held it together. Like the fox, it had a massive mouth full of spiky teeth. Its lower jaw was so separated from its upper one that Rory could see the blue-gray patterns of his room's wallpaper through the space. Clutched in the chick's massive hand with long, razor-like nails was a bright pink cupcake, with glowing white eyes and a smaller, separated jaw full of serrated teeth. The cupcake, riding in the chick's big hand, was what entered the room first, slipping through the gloomy gap in the doorway that led to the right hallway outside of Rory's room. The fact that the cupcake was a cupcake and had a smaller mouth made it no less terrifying. When the cupcake opened and closed its jaw, it made a snapping sound that raised goosebumps on Rory's skin. The creature coming from the left was similar to the other two in its decomposing awfulness and its pointy teeth and nails. The nails were the first thing Rory could see, as the creature slowly slipped its hand past the edge of the door and stepped into the room. This creature was a monstrous distortion of a purple-blue bunny, complete with long, mottled bunny ears that rose above its oversized, open-mouthed face. The fact that this monster was bunny-like made it the worst of the 3 for Rory, because he loved bunnies. This monster showed him that even the best of things could be contorted and wrecked, twisted into something ugly and gross. The creatures made a clacking and burring sound when they walked, but they moved smoothly, almost like they were floating. They weren't floating, though. When the creatures were in motion, Rory's room shook, the walls rattled, and Rory's bed vibrated. Or maybe his bed felt like it was vibrating because he was quivering. Although most of Rory was stone still, his teeth were chattering. As the creatures approached the bed, the puff, puff, puff of heavy breathing filled the room. The panting inhales and exhales, however, weren't coming from the creatures. Rory was the one making all the racket. The creatures, except for their clunking steps, made very little sound. Their movement created the faintest of chinks and whirs and the occasional creak, and somehow the fact that they didn't barrel at Rory with loud roars or bellows made them all that more horrid. The near silence of their advance gave Rory too much time to imagine what they would do to him when they reached him, and they'd reached him. Rory felt his mattress shift. His gaze whipped to the left. The monster bunny was pressed against the foot of his bed. The bunny was leaning forward. He was reaching for Rory. Finally, Rory could move. It felt like he'd been released from a tractor beam. Rory launched himself out of the bed, on the right, squinting toward the advancing chick. He was pretty sure he could scamper past it, and a mutilated brown bear with even larger teeth than those of the other creatures shot up from beneath Rory's bed and blocked his escape. The bear wore a black top hat and black bow tie. Neither gentlemanly accessory made the bear any less gruesome. With a raspy rumble, the bear's mouth hinged wider and wider. It leaned toward Rory. Cold metal clamped around Rory's wrist. Hot pain pierced his skin. Rory screamed. Rory sat up, his chest heaving. He gripped the edge of the quilt that lay atop his tangled sheets and blankets. Sweat trickled down his neck. His cotton pajamas clung to his skin. Rory's heartbeat sounded like a full drum set, pounding out an impossibly fast riff that filled the room. His eyes wide, Rory jerked his head left and right. The creatures were gone. So was the night. Through the shades covering the window high up above the head of Rory's bed, bright sunlight streamed into the room. Morning was here. The nightmare was over. Even if Rory had looked up toward the window, he knew he wouldn't see the sun. The window was well above any height he could reach, and it was covered with a shade that let in light but hid any potential view that might be seen by a very tall person. Rory never understood why his room's window was so close to the ceiling, but he'd gotten used to it. Rory leaned forward and scanned the space around him. In the warm yellow light, the bedroom looked cheerful and friendly, but Rory was still tense. He studied his surroundings carefully. Nothing looked out of place. His blue-gray furniture, a tall chest of drawers, which held a purple three-bladed fan and the lava lamp his uncle had given him, and a shorter dresser that held a yellow porcelain lamp with a gray striped shade, was placed where it always was. Both pieces of furniture sat against Rory's lavender-gray and white wallpapered walls. The wallpaper in Rory's room covered only the top 2/3 or so of the walls. Below the wallpaper, there was something called a chair rail. Rory's mom was an interior decorator, and she'd made sure he knew what things in houses were called. A chair rail was molding on the wall that divided the upper wallpaper from a different kind of wallpaper. In Rory's room, it was gray and blue striped that covered the wall between the chair rail and the floor. Whenever Rory walked past the molding, it was about the level of his chest. Rory was 4.5 feet tall, so he knew that meant the molding was about 3.5 feet off the floor. The tall chest sat against the wall opposite Rory's bed. It was next to the double-doored closet. The dresser was on the right wall, next to the doorway that led out to the hallway that went past his parents' room before reaching the living room. The white 6-paneled door was closed. So was the matching door on the other side of the room. That door led to another hall, which also went to the living room. Rory's bathroom and 2 other rooms opened off that left side hall. Staring at his folding closet door, Rory noticed it was closed too. He always made sure it was closed before he went to bed. The door was louvered, according to his mom. Rory wished it wasn't. The open slats of the louvers made the closet far too exposed to suit Rory. He knew what lived in that closet, and he wished he had a solid door he could keep closed and locked. But would a solid, locked door help? The 2 hallway doors were solid, and Rory always made sure they were closed and locked. Even so, the creatures always got the doors open, every single night. He shook himself. He blew out air. "They're just nightmares," he told himself. His voice sounded unnaturally loud in the room. Rory's voice seemed loud, he thought, because it was the only sound in the room. His bedroom was otherwise silent. No, not quite silent. A barely there hissing sound came from the vents in the ceiling above Rory's bed. He glanced up at them. The rectangular grate-covered vents looked as they always did. His mom thought ceiling vents were ugly, but the vents didn't bother Rory. He'd never seen anything bad come through the vents. The hissing sound was very soft, like a steady whisper. Rory thought the sound was soothing. Rory threw back his quilt, looking down at the purple-gray carpet that covered his bedroom floor, and tentatively hung his legs over the side of the bed. Feeling prickles at the bottom of his feet, Rory quickly dropped to his knees on the floor and looked under the bed. Nothing was there. Rory pushed himself up and stood. He looked around again. Even though he'd probably get in trouble for it, he'd left a few toys scattered around the floor of his room. A blue telephone with large googly eyes and red wheels sat contentedly next to a green plastic fish near the chest of drawers. A few feet from the rolling phone, a purple robot was hanging out in front of the dresser. Between the telephone and the robot, a rabbit stood straight up a few feet from the closet doors. The sight of the rabbit made Rory uneasy. He whipped his head away from it and sat down on the edge of his bed. He clenched the white fabric of the quilt and looked down at the hand-sewn triangles that were patchworked together with the white material. The triangles had many patterns. Some looked like circles and some were leaf or flower-shaped. All the patterns shared the same colors of blue, beige, and yellow. Rory's grandma and some of her friends had made the quilt for him. His mom said the quilt didn't match the colors in his room, but he didn't care. He liked it. Glancing at the rabbit again, Rory called out, "Mom?" When his mom didn't answer, he tried, "Dad?" His dad didn't respond either. His parents were probably getting ready for work and didn't hear him. Rory shrugged. He should stop being a weirdo and get ready for school. Standing, Rory shuffled, barefooted, to the door on the left side of the room. He hesitated only a second before gripping the door's brass knob, opening the door and stepping out into the hallway. Rory looked left and right along the length of the wood-floored hall. Like his room, the hall had the chair rail thing and two different wallpapers. The paper above the rail was kind of burgundy-orange with a fancy diamond-shaped pattern. The paper below was a dark grayish-brown with splotches of lighter gray and sorts of tree-ish patterns. Rory didn't like either of the wallpapers, but he figured they'd probably looked better than he thought they did. His mom was an expert at decorating houses. She must have known what looked good and what didn't. Nothing was in the hall other than a small hall table with one drawer. A lamp similar to the one in Rory's room, this one in the color of a pale pumpkin, sat on the table. Rory crossed the hall and went into the bathroom. The wood floor felt cool and hard under his bare feet. Somehow the bathroom had escaped his mom's love of wallpaper. It was painted light blue, and its tiled floor was dark blue and white striped. The big bathtub with feet like a creature's claws. Rory didn't like the claws. Rory used the toilet and then stood in front of the sink to wash his hands and brush his teeth. After he did these things that he was supposed to do every morning, he lifted his face and looked straight ahead so he could check his hair in the mirror. He didn't much care about his hair or the rest of what he looked like, but Rory's mom did. She was always telling him to comb his hair. Rory looked around the sink for his comb, but couldn't find it. He did his best to smooth his short hair with his fingers, but it didn't want to lay down. The dark blondish waves, his mom said his hair looked like a hayfield on a rainy day, stuck out from his head in multiple directions. His hair stood out even farther than his big ears, which poked out from both sides of his narrow head. Wade once suggested that Rory file the tops of his ears into peaks so that he could be an elf. Rory thought that was really stupid. Giving up on trying to get his hair under control, Rory bent over and sloshed water on his face. Straightening again, he used a blue towel to wipe the water off the massive freckles that covered his wide cheekbones and slightly pointed nose. Rory noticed the skin around his freckles was paler than usual. He also saw that the skin under his eyes was darker than the rest of his face. The white around his greenish-brown eyes was streaked with spiderwebby red lines. He tried to smile to reassure himself that he didn't look as bad as he thought he did, but bearing all the small, white teeth in his wide mouth made his head and face look like a crazy jack-o'-lantern. He closed his mouth and left the bathroom. Returning to his bedroom, Rory shed his pajamas and put on jeans and a green t-shirt. Both the jeans and the t-shirt were baggy. Rory wasn't a big kid. He was smaller than most of the boys in his class. His mom, however, kept expecting him to start a growing spurt, so she bought him clothes that were too large. Rory hoped his mom was right. Rory's dad loved football, and Rory wanted to get big so he could play. Rory could remember tossing a football back and forth with his dad, but the memory was hazy. They hadn't done it in a long time. He stuffed his feet into socks and pulled on a pair of navy blue sneakers. Rory left his room again, this time through the door on the right. The hallway to the right of Rory's room was the same one as on the left. His parents' room, a bathroom, and one other room opened off of this hall. All three rooms' doors were closed. Rory tried calling out to his parents again. "Mom? Dad?" Once more, he got no answer. Rory walked down the hall. Because his sneakers had rubber bottoms, Rory's footfalls on the wood floor weren't loud. His footsteps were a quiet shuffle tap. He could easily hear the other sounds in the house. He paused outside the bathroom door. Through the door, he could hear the sound of a running shower. "Mom?" he yelled. She didn't respond. Keeping his eyes closed so he wouldn't see anything he wasn't supposed to, Rory gripped the doorknob. He'd figured if he'd opened the door and yelled again, his mom would hear him. He took a deep breath. Expecting to inhale the scent of soap or shampoo coming from the bathroom, Rory was surprised when he smelled something sharper, something like medicine. He shrugged and shouted for his parents one more time. He still got no response. "Whatever," he mumbled. His dad must have already gone to work. He went to work early a lot. His mom was probably thinking hard about some decorating project while she showered, and that was why she didn't hear him. She was always thinking about her work. Even when Rory talked to her, he could tell she was thinking about her work. As he talked, her gaze would drift off to the side, and he could tell that she wasn't interested in what he was saying. He guessed that was normal, though. Mostly, he talked about his friend, Wade, and their clubhouse. That was probably boring to his mom. With his dad gone and his mom lost in thought in the shower, Rory was on his own. Well, what was new about that? Rory went down the hall and stepped into what his mom called their great room. This part of the house was open concept. This meant that the living room and dining room were one big space. Off to the side of those areas, a big island with wood stools divided the large space from a kitchen filled with shiny appliances and white cabinets. Passing a long, rectangular, dark-colored wood dining table with 6 dark plush blue chairs, Rory went around the island and walked to the end of the kitchen. That's where the fridge was. He was hungry, and his mom hadn't yet set anything out on the island for breakfast. When it came to what he liked, Rory was, in his mom's opinion, a strange kid. Rory guessed she was right. All the kids in Rory's class loved sweet things. They were always talking about how much they liked candy and ice cream, and he knew they ate sugary cereal or waffles or donuts for breakfast. Rory didn't like sweet stuff. For breakfast, Rory liked having fruit and bagels with cream cheese. Rory reached for the sleek vertical silver handle of the stainless steel fridge. He knew he'd have to wipe his finger smudges from the handle after he got his food. His mom was obsessed about smudges on her appliances. Opening the fridge, Rory wrinkled his nose. The inside of the fridge smelled stale, like the bread had gone bad. Or was it the cream cheese? Rory grabbed a bagel from a bag on the lower shelf and opened the cheese drawer to get out a carton of spreadable cream cheese. He frowned. They didn't have any cream cheese. Rory shrugged. He'd have to remind his mom to buy some cream cheese. Opening the lower produce drawer, Rory grabbed a pear. The pear was browner than it should have been, and maybe a little softer than what was best for a pear, but Rory figured it would be alright too. Closing the fridge door, Rory cradled the bagel and pear, and he used the back of his free hand to wipe a smudge off the fridge door handle. Then he carried everything to the island. Grabbing a paper towel off the roll by the big white sink, Rory returned to the island and spread out the paper towel on the island's gray granite counter. His mom always nagged him about using plates, but he didn't like to mess with dishes. The only thing he ever washed was the small glass he used for water when he got thirsty during the day. He always rinsed that glass and kept it by the sink. Climbing up onto one of the stools, Rory set his bagel and pear on the paper towel. He lifted the bagel and smelled it. It might have been a little old, but it looked okay. He took a hesitant bite at the bagel. He quirked his lips as he chewed. The bagel was dry, but it wasn't terrible. Rory reached for the pear and bit into it. It, too, wasn't at its best, but it was okay. As he ate, Rory listened for his mom. She had to be out of the shower by now, didn't she? Apparently not. Rory could still hear the shushing crackle of the shower's running water. Rory finished his breakfast and cleaned up after himself, making sure he left no crumbs on the counter. His mom was as obsessive about crumbs as she was about smudges on stainless steel. As he put his trash in the bin under the kitchen sink, Rory suddenly realized he was going to be late for school if he didn't get moving. Hurrying out of the kitchen, Rory spotted his red backpack next to the end of the blue and white checkered sofa in the living room part of the great room. Good thing he'd left his backpack there so he didn't have to take the time to go back to his room. Rory picked it up and slipped it over his shoulders. He hurried across the living room's wood floor toward the... He stopped. Where was the front door? Turning in a full circle, Rory frowned as he tried to find the door that would lead out of the house. For some reason, he couldn't remember where it was supposed to be. The living room, like most of the rest of the house, had 2 different wallpapers separated by another chair rail. The paper in there had vertical stripes of bright blue and white above the rail. These colors matched the sofa and the rectangular rug under the oval coffee table in front of the sofa. Below the rail, wider vertical stripes of beige and cream colors matched his dad's recliner and a TV cabinet. A couple paintings and 2 groupings of family photos hung on the blue and white part of the walls. The rest of the walls were bare, but for a couple of windows covered with cloth shades. The shades were thin enough that the daylight shone through them, but they were thick enough to make it impossible to see through to the outside. He didn't care about seeing through the windows, though. He wanted a door, not a window. Rory walked around the entire living room and dining room area. As he did, his brain started getting a little mushy. With every step he took, he felt a little drowsier. By the time he had gone around the room twice, he felt like he was in a fog. Why couldn't he find his way out of this house? And where was his mom? Rory adjusted his backpack on his shoulders. He stepped back down the hall toward his parents' bedroom. When he reached the other room off the hall leading to his parents' room, Rory tried its door. Just as he couldn't remember where the door was in the great room, he couldn't remember what was in this room either. He wasn't going to find out now, though. The handle jiggled, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked. Rory walked on and paused in front of his parents' door. From there, he could still hear the shower in the bathroom. Maybe his dad hadn't left for work, though. Perhaps his dad had slept in or something. "Dad," Rory called out, "are you in there?" When his dad didn't answer him, Rory put his ear to the door. The painted wood felt smooth and cool against his ear. Rory's ear, however, didn't give him any information. He heard nothing. Knowing he shouldn't just barge into his parents' room, but wishing he could find his mom or dad, Rory gripped the door handle and tried to turn it. Like the one on the other room's door, the knob wiggled a little, but the door wouldn't open. Rory stepped a few feet forward and tried the bathroom door again. The door wouldn't give. Behind the door, the sound of the shower continued. Rory looked down the hall. Was there a back door out of the house somewhere? He couldn't remember a back door off this hall, but then he couldn't remember his house not having a door at all either. He wandered down the hall. It ended just past the doorway to his bedroom, and there was a door there. Rory tried it. Like the other doors he'd tried, this one remained closed. He tried a little harder to get this one open, but no matter how much he rattled the knob and shoved at the door's hard surface, it didn't give at all. Rory shrugged. He didn't think this was a door that led outside anyways. It was probably the door to a closet. A closet wouldn't help him. Rory turned around and headed back down the hall. Going into his bedroom through its right side door, he looked around. His bed was still mussed, his pillows askew against the slatted wood headboard. His mom wouldn't like it if she saw that he hadn't made his bed. Rory went to the head of his bed and pulled up the sheets and blankets. He smoothed them out, put the pillows in their right place at the head of the bed, and then pulled the quilt up to cover everything. Patting the quilt, he nodded. "That's better," he said. Once again, his words sounded unusually loud, and behind the bottom of his voice, the steady hissing above his bed sounded like a subdued murmur, as if someone, maybe Rory's mom, was saying shh, letting him know everything was okay. Rory smiled dreamily. Everything's okay, he told himself. This time, when he spoke, he made sure to keep his voice low. Walking through his room, Rory exited it through the left side door. Looking to his left in the hallway, he spotted another door at the end of it. Was that a back door that led outside? Rory took a couple steps to the door and tried to turn the knob. It was just like all the other knobs Rory had attempted to turn. It shifted a tiny bit, but wouldn't rotate to open the door. He turned around and put his back to the locked door. He went back down the hall toward the great room. Although the bathroom door was open as Rory had left it earlier, the other two doors along the hall were closed. They were also locked. He moved on past them, and then he was back in the great room again. Rory stopped there near the dining room table. He shifted the weight of his backpack on his back. He felt like he was missing something. He had to have been. He should have been able to pick up his backpack and leave the house to go to school. That should have been a simple thing, shouldn't it? Not sure what else to do, Rory walked through the house again, and again. Feeling disoriented and a little loopy, like he was just on the edge of falling asleep, but not quite there yet, Rory paced through his house over and over. He was so caught up in his quest to find a door that he lost track of time. He couldn't tell if time was passing slowly or quickly, and he didn't care. He just wanted to find the door so he could go to school. On a pass through the great room, Rory noticed that the room was darker than it had been the last time he'd walked through it. He glanced at the windows. The shades over the windows weren't the nice bright yellow color they'd been when the sun had been out. They were turning a dingy gray. Daylight was fading. In fact, it was nearly gone. Time for bed, Rory said to himself. Good, he thought. He was so tired. He was more than ready to get under the covers and snuggle into his nice, warm bed. Rory shrugged out of his backpack. He dropped it near the end of the blue and white checkered sofa, turned, and walked down the hall to the bathroom. He was tired, but he didn't want to go to bed without a shower. Stripping out of his clothes in the bathroom, Rory curled his hand around the chrome knob that jutted from the white tile that surrounded the tub. For a second, he was afraid to turn the knob. Every knob he'd turned today had refused to budge. His eyes heavy and limbs getting even heavier, Rory sighed at his silliness. He turned the knob. The shower spray cascaded down into the tub. The rushing sound was reassuring. The sound reminded him of his mom's shower. He couldn't remember if he'd heard the shower the last time that he'd gone down the right side hall. He must not have. His mom must have left for work when Rory was in the left side hall. She would have figured that he'd already gone to school, so she wouldn't have gone looking for him. Rory took a quick shower. He brushed his teeth. Then he gathered his clothes and trotted into his room. Closing and locking the door behind him, Rory crossed his room and closed and locked the other door as well. Then he put on his favorite PJs. They were black and white zebra striped. By now, Rory's room was lit only by the weak glow of his nightstand lamp, a smaller version of the lamp on top of his dresser. The little lamp threw a faint circle of light out around his bed. Behind the circle, the rest of the room was in shadows. All the shapes that squatted in those shadows suddenly looked dangerous and threatening. Rory quickly went to his closet door. He tossed his clothes into a blue plastic laundry basket on the floor and then closed the door firmly. He scuttled to his bed, threw back the quilt and covers, and dove under them. He pulled the covers up to his chin and looked around the room. The lumpy shapes in the room made Rory nervous, but at least none of them moved, yet. Rory risked slipping an arm from beneath his covers to turn off his bedside lamp. He closed his eyes, letting the steady hiss from the vents lull him to sleep as the drowsiness he'd felt all day finally claimed him. Rory's eyes shot open. It was midnight again, he was sure, or close enough. A scurrying sound came from the closet at the other end of the room. Rory lifted his head from the pillow very slowly. He raised his head only an inch, if that. He blinked several times, willing his eyes to adjust to the room's darkness. He had to see what the sound was. The closet door was cracked open. He closed it before he'd gone to bed, hadn't he? Rory watched the gap. He stared so hard, so unblinkingly, that his eyes started to sting. But he didn't blink. If he did, he might miss it if the door opened farther. Don't blink, don't blink. He blinked. As he opened his eyes again, he caught the tip of the gleaming metal hook curling around the edge of the closet door. He heard a metallic rasp. The door creaked. A pair of glowing white eyes looked through the crack between the closet doors. No. Rory checked the doors that led out to the hallways that flanked the room. He'd closed them too, he was positive about that. They weren't closed now. Knife-like nails curled around the edges of the door. One blazing white eye peered through each opening. As Rory watched, trying to control the shudders that wanted to rack his body, both doors opened even more. One eye in each doorway became two. Now 4 eyes stared at him from the open doors. No, 6. Rory could see a smaller set of radiant white eyes lower down in the right side gap. It was the murderous cupcake with the gaping mouth full of teeth. Rory kept watching. What else could he do? He couldn't move, even though he wanted to run more than anything. The closet door and the hall doors opened wider. The gigantic mouths full of shark-like teeth appeared. The tattered bodies wormed into view. Zombie-like versions of a fox, chick, and a bunny began to plod towards Rory's bed. Run! Rory's mind screamed at him. Finally, Rory was able to get his body to work. He threw back his covers. He sprang from his bed. Before Rory could take a step, however, another pair of gleaming eyes was suddenly right in front of him. Beneath the eyes, another cavern of a mouth full of pointy teeth opened. The teeth were inches from Rory's face. Rory shrieked. Rory opened his eyes and blinked at the sun's glaring rays. Wiping sweat from his forehead, he wrinkled his nose at the musky stench of his body. His skin felt wet and sticky. His pajamas were twisted around him, and they clung to him. Lying still and scanning the room, Rory concentrated on breathing slow and evenly. The sound of his quiet, controlled breathing relaxed the tightness in his muscles. He continued to focus on his inhales and exhales. As he listened to himself breathe, Rory realized that the sound of his breathing was a gentle percussion beneath the steady whispers coming from above him. Rory looked up. Right, the vents. Their usual hiss comforted Rory. The night was over. All was well. Or was it? Rory sat up, his hands balled into fists. He looked around the room. Everything was as it should have been. Both his hall doors and his closet door were closed. Rory swung his legs out of his bed. "Mom?" he called. "Dad?" Rory's parents didn't respond. He shrugged and went to his closet. At the double louvered doors, he paused. His nightmare was niggling at the edges of his consciousness. He was afraid to open the doors. There's nothing there, he told himself. Rory's voice bounced off the room's walls and came back at him like a punch in the face. He shook his head and made himself open the closet doors. Everything in the closet was what was supposed to be in the closet. There was nothing scary in sight. Rory realized that his shoulders were nearly up by his ears. He relaxed them. He looked down and discovered his hands were out in front of him, as if he was getting ready to ward off an attack. He dropped his hands. Rory gathered his clothes, closed his closet, and left his room to go into the bathroom. He examined his pinched face in the mirror. He was paler than he should have been. Rory rolled his eyes. He was fine. Who cared what color his skin was? Going back into his room, Rory made his bed. Then he left his room through the right side door. He headed down the hall and called for his parents again. When they didn't answer, he concluded that his dad was at work and his mom was in the shower. He could hear the shower running through his parents' bathroom door. Same ol', Rory said to himself, chuckling. His dad usually went to work early. His mom took very long showers. It wasn't a problem. Rory was used to fending for himself. Making his way down the hall through the great room and into the kitchen, Rory scrounged up some breakfast. He grabbed a bagel that seemed a little harder than it should have been, and a peach that was a little softer than he wanted it to be. When Rory finished his breakfast, he tried one last time to call out to his mom. "Mom, you out of the shower yet?" She didn't answer him. Maybe she'd gotten out of the shower and left for work while he was eating. His mom often told him that when he was eating, he wouldn't notice an elephant if it sat down next to him. Rory grinned at the idea of a visiting elephant as he pulled on his backpack and headed toward the... Where was the front door? Rory frowned and turned in a full circle. How could he have forgotten where the door was? Rory rubbed his eyes. They felt dry and droopy. Shaking off a sudden sense of sleepiness, Rory walked around the edges of the great room, trailing his hand along the chair rail as he went. He wasn't sure why he was doing that. It wasn't like the door was going to be invisible or something, but he kept slipping his hand along the chair rail, and when he finished going around the great room, he kept his hand on the chair rail as he went down the hall toward his parents' room. He wiggled the doorknob on every closed door he came to. None of the doors opened. Rory tried calling out to his parents again, even though he knew that was pointless. They were at work, or his mom was still in the shower. Rory could hear the shower running, so she must have been. Either that, or she'd forgotten to turn off the shower. If she'd done that, she'd be annoyed when she got home and realized how much water she'd wasted. By the time the light shining through the shades in the great room began to fade, Rory wasn't sure how many times he'd gone through the house. A dozen? More? The whole time he traipsed through the house, he had a powerful sense that something was getting past him. There was something he should have noticed, something he should have done differently, but he didn't know what it was. When the house began to fill with puddles of darkness, Rory got ready for bed. Making sure he closed his closet door and the doors to his hallways, he got into bed. By then, Rory was so tired that he could barely stay awake long enough to turn off his lamp. Once he switched it off, Rory pulled up the covers and closed his eyes. He was asleep immediately. Rory's eyes shot open. The creatures came at midnight. Like always, they somehow got the doors open. They skulked into the room. They closed in around Rory's bed. White eyes, saw-toothed mouths, decomposing bodies, clankety-clank. Rory tried to get away. That's when the fourth creature appeared. The bear with the top hat drew itself up to loom over Rory as if arising from a grave under Rory's bed. Mouth opening impossibly wide, the bear aimed its teeth at Rory's head. Rory's cry jolted him awake. As soon as his eyes opened, Rory was blinded by the sun. He didn't, however, close his eyes against it. He was grateful for the brightness. It was what made it possible for him to look around the room and assure himself that nothing was in the room besides what was supposed to be there. He was alone. He was safe. Rory called for his mom and dad, but they didn't answer. Rory could hear the sound of a shower running, even over the hiss of air flowing from the vents above his bed. He figured his mom was in the shower. She showered a lot. His dad was probably at work. Rory was amazed at how much his dad worked. Didn't his dad ever get tired? Rory wished he saw his dad more, and his mom too. She worked almost as much as his dad. It seemed like Rory was alone a lot. That was okay though. He was used to it. Rory went into the bathroom and washed away the sweat from the previous night. He brushed his teeth and gave in to his hair's need to stick out around his head like he was a porcupine instead of a boy. After he dressed, Rory went into the kitchen to get some breakfast. When Rory looked in the fridge, he discovered there weren't any bagels. Bagels were his favorite breakfast food, but wheat toast was okay. The wheat bread was in the fridge, and it looked a little moldy. Rory figured he could scrape off the mold, though. He also found an apple. The apple was a little shriveled. Otherwise, it looked okay. Rory wished he had some peanut butter for his bread, but he couldn't find any. He ended up eating the bread plain. It was dry, but it tasted alright. So did the apple, although it wasn't as crisp as Rory wanted it to be. As soon as he was done with breakfast, Rory knew he was going to be late for school if he didn't hurry. Rushing through the great room, he snatched up his backpack from the floor by the sofa. Slipping it onto his back, he started toward the... Where was the front door? Rory frowned and looked around. He saw the usual furniture and wallpaper, and the windows with the shades that let in the lights but didn't let Rory see outside. He didn't, however, see a door. Where'd the door go? Feeling fuzzy like he'd stayed up too late, Rory began making his way through the house, looking for the door. A couple times, he called out to his mom in case she was still there. She never answered. She had to have gone to work, either while Rory had been in the bathroom or while he'd been concentrating on getting his breakfast. When Rory had been a little younger, his mom had taken him to school, but now he walked on his own. His mom was often so focused on her work that she left without remembering to say goodbye to him. Rory made a circuit through the house. When he couldn't find the door, the only thing he could think to do was take another pass through the house. So he started over and went down the hall toward his parents' room again. Halfway down the hall, Rory stopped. He listened carefully. Rory was familiar with the normal noises in the house. He was used to hearing a hiss from the vents and the hum of the refrigerator's motor. Because his mom took so many showers that were really long, he well knew the sound of continually running water, too. Now, though, Rory could hear something else. It surprised him. It was a noise he'd never heard before in this house. The noise was a knocking sound, and it was coming from inside one of the walls. Which one? Rory couldn't tell. The knocking sound wasn't a knocking like a person would do. There wasn't some little trapped fairy or something in the walls, although the idea of that made Rory smile. No, the knocking Rory heard was like the clunking sound an engine might make if it was having trouble running. It was like a heavy chugging sound wrapped in a sharp thunk. Rory was just starting to learn about cars, so he didn't know a lot about engines. From what little he knew, he thought what he was hearing sounded like an engine's pistons misfiring. The bangs in the wall sounded like an engine about to fail. Rory walked along the hallway, his ear to the wall. He listened, and he thought about what he was hearing. He couldn't make sense of it. Why would there be an engine in the walls? The sound stopped just abruptly as it had started. Well, almost everything. The hissing sound, the sound of the shower stopped. The only thing that continued was the refrigerator's hum. Other than that, the house was silent. The only other sound besides the refrigerator that Rory could hear was that of his own breathing and his own footsteps. Rory stood still and listened. Nope, nothing else. That's weird, Rory said. He didn't care much about it, though. He was so tired. He could barely keep his eyes open. The last time he'd been in the great room, the sun had no longer been shining through the shades anyway. It was time for bed. Rory went into the bathroom and showered. Then he went to his room, closed all his doors, and got into bed. He was asleep as soon as he turned out his light. Rory's eyes shot open. He squinted into the sun's perky yellow rays. He watched little specks of dust dance in the streams of light that slanted down over his bed, and he stretched his arms above his head. He felt great. Rory dropped his arms back to his side and took in a big breath of air. He wiggled his legs and flexed his toes. He felt different from how he usually felt in the morning. Why? The answer came quickly. No nightmares. Rory hadn't dreamed at all. He'd slept peacefully through the night. The creatures hadn't come. Rory frowned. No, it wasn't just that. It was something else, too. Rory sat up and looked around his room. He gasped. What had happened to his room? Although the room Rory was in was still clearly his room, with its blue-gray furniture and lavender-gray and white wallpaper and white doors and purple-gray carpet and scattering of toys, it definitely wasn't his room as he remembered it. Something was wrong. Yesterday, everything in Rory's room had been clean and nice. Today, everything was dirty. Really dirty. And it wasn't nice. Not at all. The wallpaper, for one thing, was peeling off the walls. Wide strips of wallpaper above the chair rails were drooping down over it. The strips were crusty, and the backside of them were yellow. The wallpaper below the chair rail was peeling off the wall too. Some of it had fallen onto the carpet. The carpet was in awful shape as well. It was filthy. A thick coating of dust looked like a layer of fuzz. The fuzz was disturbed by a jumble of footprints. Rory leaned forward and stared at the prints. They were big, even bigger than his large feet. Had the creatures left these prints? Rory's gaze flitted to the closet door. He frowned. One of the closet doors was sagging off its hinges. The other one was bent. Both closet doors were covered with dust. Rory looked left and right at the other two doors. They were dingy and dusty, but they were closed. Realizing that he needed to pee, Rory had to set aside the mystery of what had happened to his room. He reached down to push his quilt back. Rory's hand froze. He looked at the quilt. It was no longer white. It was so dirty, it was almost brown. The material of the quilt was thin too, and the triangular patches were coming apart from one another. Well, Rory could worry about that later. He needed to get into the bathroom. Rory swung his legs over the side of the bed. Once again, he froze. Rory stared down at his bare legs. Where were his pajamas? And why were his legs so long and furry? Where did the hair come from? Panicked, Rory shouted, "Mom?" The sound of Rory's voice nearly made him fall off the bed. Mom came out in a deep tone that sounded more like his dad's voice than his own. What had happened to Rory? Rory's mom didn't answer, and Rory's need for the toilet was now more important than anything. Rory pushed off the bed and stood. He now towered over the bed. Rory's stomach flipped over as he ran toward the door to the hallway. His breathing came out in rapid bursts as he grabbed the doorknob. That's when he saw his hand. His hand was at least twice the size he'd remembered it being. The knob disappeared beneath his broad palm and his long fingers. Big hand or not, though, Rory still needed a pee. He flung the door open and dashed across the hall to the bathroom. Even as he made a beeline for the toilet, he noticed the chair rail was now below his waist level instead of near his chest. Rory was practically hyperventilating by the time he flushed the toilet. He was almost afraid to turn toward the mirror, but he had to. Rory stepped up to the sink and looked into the mirror. His mouth dropped open and his eyes widened. The image in the mirror gaped back at him. Both Rory and the guy in the mirror opened their mouths wider and screamed, "Mom?" Neither Rory nor the guy in the mirror received a reply, so they kept staring at each other. Was the guy in the mirror as in awe of Rory as Rory was of the guy in the mirror? Rory leaned forward, and so did the guy in the mirror. The last time Rory remembered looking in the mirror, wasn't that just yesterday? He'd been looking into the brownish-green eyes of a skinny boy. The boy Rory remembered had a narrow face with freckles and short, spiky hair. The eyes that looked back at Rory now were the same eyes Rory remembered. The ears jutting out from the sides of the narrow head were too familiar. The rest of the face, however, was foreign to him. Rory's face was longer than he'd remembered. Long and bony, the cheekbones jutted out. The face still had some freckles, but red bumps of acne overpowered them. Below the acne, bristles of facial hair darkened the hard jawline, and his hair, Rory's hair, was really long. It was still messy, but now the mess was a tangle that fell well past his shoulders. Bare and wide, but almost skeletal shoulders. Below the shoulders, a thin spray of dark blonde hair covered his skinny chest. Rory knew himself as a 7-year-old kid, but what he was seeing in the mirror was more like a 17-year-old teenager. How had he jumped ahead 10 years? He suddenly remembered the fairy tale about Rip Van Winkle, who had gone to sleep and slept for 20 years. Had Rory done something like that? But how? Rory was so freaked out by what was going on that he wanted to run from the bathroom. Turning away from the mirror, Rory shouted again, "Mom?" His mom didn't answer. Rory looked down at his bare body. He shivered and looked around wildly, as if the bathroom could help him figure out what had happened. A closer look at the bathroom, however, just made the mystery worse. The bathroom was a mess. The sink, toilet, and tub all had rusty-looking stains, and the tiled floor was scuffed and scummy. Paint peeled from the walls. The bathroom looked like one you'd find in a haunted house. Why? Whatever was going on, Rory didn't want to face it without clothes, so Rory threw open the bathroom door and quickly sprinted from the bathroom back into his bedroom. Yanking back the broken closet doors, he reached for his clothes. The clothes, however, weren't what Rory needed. For one thing, they were dirty and wrinkled and worn. For another, they were way too small. These were the clothes Rory remembered wearing when he was his 7-year-old self. How would they fit this new big version of him? Rory nearly tore his closet apart trying to find something reasonable to put on. Eventually, he managed to find a pair of black and white zebra-striped pajama bottoms that he was able to squirm into. The hems of the legs hit him at knee level, and the waistband was really tight, but he could live with it. It was better than going around without pants on. The only shirt he could find that wasn't so small that it ripped when he tried to put it on was a bright red one. It fit him like it was painted onto his skin, and its hem landed just below his ribs, so his belly was bare. Again, though, it was better than nothing. The pajama bottoms and the shirt didn't smell very good. They kind of stank, actually. They reeked of old sweat. They were a little stiff, too. But what other choice did Rory have? He wasn't going to wander around without any clothes on. Without expecting much, Rory looked for socks and shoes that fit. He found socks that he was able to stretch over his feet, but the shoe situation was hopeless. He'd have to stick with socks for now. Maybe if he could find his mom, they could go out and shop for some new clothes. The paper in the hall was falling off the wall in long, curling strips that drooped onto the wood floor. The floor was thick with dust that was scuffed by large footprints. Rory realized now that those footprints must have been his own. They were the same size as his feet. Had he been walking in his sleep? The hallway floor was weird, too. It wasn't the wood floor he remembered. Part of the floor was like the floor, but running down the middle of it was a metal track embedded in the wood, like streetcar tracks. Rory had seen those once when his parents had taken him into a big city that had cool streetcars that went up and down steep hills. But why were there metal rails in his house? What were they for? Rory followed the tracks down the hall to the great room and found more of the same decay. The furniture was grimy and all the plush cushions were flattened. There was more peeling wallpaper in there, and the shades that covered the windows were yellowed and limp, as if they could barely manage to cling to their brackets. Rory looked toward the kitchen. He chewed on his lower lip. There was no way his mom would have let her kitchen get into this state. Not only was it covered in dust, but crumbs were also everywhere. A trail of ants were marching out of the cabinet under the sink. Rory wrinkled his nose. The kitchen smelled awful, too. Was it spoiled food? No, he didn't think so. The air smelled more like the way his grandma's attic had smelled when she had a leak in her roof. The thought of spoiled food made Rory's chest tighten. What if he had slept for 10 years? Would there be any food left for him? Rory hurried to the fridge. His feet stirred up dust bunnies as he went. They fluttered over the floor and settled under the edge of the kitchen's lower cabinets. Marred by too many smudges to count, the refrigerator handle rattled in Rory's grasp as he pulled on it. The fridge door opened, and Rory gawked at its interior. What in the world? Rory remembered the refrigerator as being filled with plastic shelving and drawers. Juices were on the top shelf, stuff like ketchup and mustard were on the door. Plastic containers of leftovers were on the middle shelves. Cheese and meats were in the cheese drawer. Veggies and fruits were in 2 produce drawers at the bottom of the fridge. That, however, wasn't what Rory was seeing now. The inside of the fridge didn't look like the inside of a fridge. It looked more like a dispenser, with rows of food similar to the ones Rory had seen in vending machines. He leaned forward and looked at the small yellow wrappers that contained something about the size of a fun-sized candy bar. The packages looked old, their edges were a little ratty, and the labels had faded. Curious, Rory plucked out one of the packages. He opened it. Without much enthusiasm, Rory lifted a crunchy-looking tan wafer from the packaging. He held it to his nose. It smelled sort of like vanilla, but not really. Rory's stomach growled. He was hungry, so he figured whatever this was, it was better than going without food. He put the wafer against his tongue. It didn't taste like much, but it didn't taste bad either. He put the wafer in his mouth and chewed it. Dry and brittle, the wafer disintegrated on his tongue. Rory made a face and managed to swallow the flaky wafer. He quickly went to the sink and turned on the tap. When clear water ran from the faucet, Rory exhaled in relief. For a second, he'd been afraid that icky water would come out, or worse, no water at all. Rory spotted his glass next to the sink. It looked clean enough, so he grabbed it, filled it, and gulped down half the glass. When Rory had washed away the dry remains of the wafer, he straightened. What now? Rory had to find his mom. Maybe she could explain what was going on. When he reached the door, he called out, "Mom?" She didn't answer, so he tried the door. It was locked. Rory backed away from the door and frowned at it. The door, he realized, wasn't actually a door. It had no hinges, and there was no gaps around the edges where the door could open away from the wall. Why did his parents' room have a fake door? Rory turned away from the bizarre imitation door. He could hear a shower running behind a door a few feet farther down the hall, so he moved on and stopped in front of that bathroom door. His mom had to be in the shower. She'd tell him what was going on. When Rory reached the bathroom door, though, he discovered that it too was not a real door. Rory put his ear to the slab of wood that was masquerading as a door. Why was he hearing a shower? Cocking his head, Rory noticed that the running water sound was not coming from the other side of the fake door as he'd assumed it was. The sound was coming from above the door. Rory stepped back and looked up. He screwed up his face as he stared at a rectangular black speaker set high on the wall. The shower sound came from that speaker. Rory opened his mouth to call for his mom again, but he abruptly clamped his lips together. If the door wasn't real and the shower wasn't real, was his mom real? His legs a little shaky and his heart pounding, Rory turned to continue on down the hall. This hall, like the one on the other side of his bedroom, had the same metal tracks set into the wood floor. Rory followed the tracks, and he saw that they split into 2 sets by his bedroom door. One set of tracks veered toward his room. The other set ran on to the end of the hall. This second set disappeared underneath another door. Was that one real? Rory ignored the questionable door and followed the metal tracks into his room. There he saw the tracks continued. They were set into the carpet. Why hadn't he seen that earlier? He'd probably been too baffled by everything else to notice the floor. Now, though, he followed the tracks. They led up to his bed. Rory scanned the rest of the carpet in his room. Another set of tracks ran from the closet to the bed, and another set ran from the other side of the bed to the doorway leading to the left side hall. Examining the door, Rory decided that this one was real. It had hinges and cracks around the edges of its dirty, white-painted surface. Rory grasped the door's knob and turned it. At first, the door didn't budge, but Rory was determined to get it open, so he took hold of the knob with both hands and yanked. The door popped open. Rory jerked back so quickly that he stumbled. His heart began beating fast and hard. Its thrumming filled his ears. Rory started to turn to run, but before he had completed his turn, he realized he wasn't seeing what he thought he was seeing. He suddenly understood, no reason to run. Rory took a deep breath. He faced what was in the closet. Looking back at him from the shadows of a small, dusty enclosure, the decrepit purple-blue bunny that was a major player in Rory's ongoing nightmares gazed, dark-eyed and still, straight ahead. The bunny was as Rory remembered it from his night terrors. It had tattered fur torn apart so horridly that Rory could see completely through the gaping holes in the bunny's torso. The bunny had deadly-looking teeth and claws, but those teeth and claws were rigid and unmoving. Rory took a step forward. He leaned in and examined the metal that he could see through the ratty fur. Rory was so surprised by what he was seeing that he had to clutch the doorframe to keep himself upright. He goggled at what stood before him. Rory's nightmare creature was nothing more than a spooky life-sized figurine. It was a costume hung on a flimsy, metallic skeleton. It couldn't move on its own. It was transported into Rory's room on rails. It was just a mechanical trick. Rory clenched his fists. He slammed the door in the phony creature's face, and he turned to stride back into his room. There, Rory marched to his closet. He investigated the back of it, and he quickly found the fox version of the creature that terrorized him at night. Rory stomped out of the closet and went to his bed. Dropping to his knees, he found a flap in the carpet. Under the carpet was a trap door. Beneath the trap door, he saw the horrific bear that had always blocked his escape from the creatures. It, too, was nothing more than an oversized puppet. His head starting to pound, Rory left his room via the door on the right and followed the hallway tracks to the door at the end of the hall. There, he found the disintegrating chick and its cupcake. It was all fake, every bit of it. But why? Rory tore through the house to find out what else wasn't real. It didn't take long to discover that the rest of the locked doors weren't actual doors. The only doors that opened were his bedroom doors and the doors that enclosed the nightmare creatures. Rory walked through the house once more, studying the dirty floors. He looked for more trapdoors, but he didn't find any. He returned to the kitchen, unable to let go of a hunch he had about the refrigerator. Although stocked with the dry wafers, the dispenser had to be refilled from somewhere. Rory flung open the refrigerator door. He glared at the dispenser and its rows of wafers in yellow wrappers. He grabbed the little packages, threw them over his shoulder, and stripped the dispenser completely. It was attached to the fridge's sides by metal clips. It just took a sharp tug for the dispenser to groan and twang and let go of the clips. Rory fell back and barely kept his balance. Tossing aside the dispenser's guts, he looked into the fridge. It wasn't actually a fridge. There was no back to the appliance. Instead, the fridge's interior was a tunnel-like enclosure that extended back behind the fridge, reaching through the kitchen's wall. The metal tunnel led to a metal door. Although the door had no handle, Rory could easily see its edges. Rory hunched over and crawled into the long, narrow enclosure. He wriggled forward until he could put his hands on the door. The flimsy metal gave a little under his palm. Rory lunged forward and shoved the metal, and the door popped loose with a clatter. He clambered forward and looked through the opening. Nothing but blackness looked back at him, but that was better than a pair of glowing eyes. Not willing to dive headfirst into a space he couldn't see, Rory backed out of the passage. His mom kept a flashlight in a kitchen drawer, didn't she? Rory pulled out the drawer, and yes, sure enough, there was a flashlight. Flipping it on, he crawled back into the fridge and shone the light through the opening. Now, in the pale yellow glow of barely there light, Rory could see the bent metal door lying on what looked like a concrete floor. The floor looked like it was just a few feet below the opening. Rory could see now, but he couldn't see very much, so again he backed out and this time re-entered the passage feet first. Scooting on his butt, he squirmed forward until he could stick his feet through the opening at the back of the dispenser. Rory landed in a crouch, with one foot on concrete and the other foot on the fallen metal door. He straightened and quickly turned in a circle, shining his flashlight beam out around him. Rory frowned. What was this place? Rory was in a concrete corridor. In the faint glow of his flashlight, it was hard to see the details of what was around him. The corridor, however, appeared to be lined with metal racks. The racks were filled with, of all things, something that looked like scuba tanks. Rory stepped over to one. He aimed his light at some of the writing on it. Danger. Compressed gas. Gas? What kind of gas? Rory leaned over and sniffed the valve. He could smell nothing but the corridor's damp. Rory looked around some more. All the tanks, he realized, were connected to rubber hoses. The network of hoses lined the hallway, and they all came together in a cluster that fed into the wall next to the opening Rory had just come through. Whatever the gas was, it was being pumped into Rory's house. Rory scrunched up his face and walked down the corridor, his flashlight's rays zipping this way and that. The tangle of black hoses that wormed all over the walls reminded Rory of snakes, and even though the hoses weren't moving, Rory kept his gaze on them as he stepped carefully past the tanks. This attention to the hoses was what led him to an old gray machine at the end of the corridor. Rory didn't know anything about machines, but he could tell this one wasn't running. It had a fan, sort of like the purple one in his room, and the fan blades were still. No sound came from the machine. Rory went on past it. A few feet beyond the machine, just before an open doorway, Rory came to a small gray metal desk. Rory aimed his light at the desk's surface, and the beam illuminated the metal part of a clipboard lying at one end of the desk. Rory could see the edges of some curling papers clamped onto the clipboard. Maybe something on the papers would explain what was going on. Rory picked up the clipboard. He moved his light so it shone directly on it. The first thing Rory saw on the top sheet of the paper was a date. It was a date just a month after his 7th birthday. He read a handwritten entry next to the date. Subject continues to react with fear, Rory read aloud, to what he perceives to be creatures. Fear level 9. Perceives to be, Rory repeated. Rory pursed his lips. Rory wasn't the best reader in the world. He'd struggled with reading in school, but his friend Wade was a really good reader. He'd taught Rory lots of words, so Rory knew what perceives meant. It meant that his brain was telling him something, and given the way the entry on the clipboard was worded, Rory concluded that whatever his brain was telling him wasn't necessarily the truth. Rory read as fast as he could. He flipped through the pages on the clipboard. Because most of the entries were short, and nearly all of them were the same or similar, it didn't take Rory long to figure out what he was looking at. When Rory reached the bottom page on the clipboard, he flipped back to the top one. He looked at the date again. Rory dropped the clipboard and began searching the rest of the desktop and the desk drawers. He didn't find any other papers. A straight-backed, black metal chair sat in front of the desk. Rory, too shocked to continue standing, dropped onto it. He stared at the clipboard. Then he turned and aimed his light back down the corridor at the rows of gas tanks. Finally, he shifted his light to the machine that wasn't running. Tears filled Rory's eyes. At the same time, his face heated up. He clenched his teeth. It was all fake. Everything he'd thought he knew about his life was a lie. Did I ever have the life I thought I was living? Rory wondered. Although his memories were fuzzy, Rory had clear images in his head of his mom and dad. He could remember talking with them and doing things with them. The same was true of school and his friend Wade. In Rory's mind, the house he'd woke up in that morning was his house, although the house in his memories was clean and new and tidy. But none of the images in Rory's head were real. Nothing in Rory's life was real. According to the papers on the clipboard, the gas in the gas tanks were hallucinogenics. These were drugs that made him think he was seeing and doing things he wasn't seeing and doing. The gas was what made him think he was living in the house with his parents. The gas was what made him think he had to go to school. The gas made him think he was eating real food, when in fact the whole time he was eating the awful wafers. The wafers, the paper said, were freeze-dried sources of all the nutrients a human body needed. That might have been true, Rory thought, but given how skinny he was, he didn't think the wafers were enough for him anymore. The gas was also the source of his night terrors. Apparently, the whole thing was a nasty experiment designed to study the effects of ongoing fear in children. Whoever was behind the experiment wanted to see what happened if a child faced the same horrors night after night after night, with no real life during the day to balance out the awfulness of the nightmares. Because the latest entry on the clipboard had been made the same year that Rory had turned 7, he concluded that this awful place had been abandoned 10 years ago. The gas lines and the food dispenser and everything else must have been automated. Rory looked again at the silent machine. He wasn't sure, but he thought the machine was a pump. If it was responsible for the stream of gas that kept Rory living in an illusion. It must have broken down. That was why the gas stopped, and when the gas stopped, Rory saw through the illusion. That was why he could now see that he was a teenager instead of the boy he'd thought he was. No wonder none of Rory's clothes fit. No wonder the house was a mess. Suddenly, it all made sense. Rory hadn't been sleeping for the past 10 years. He'd been up and conscious. Everything he'd done in a haze caused by that gas that constantly hissed in the house through the vents in the ceiling. That gas had kept him from seeing what was really going on around him. It had kept him locked in a perpetual childhood, understanding his surroundings on only the most basic level. That gas had kept Rory in a jail of misery. The whole experiment was mean, really mean. Someone had been here watching Rory, recording all his reactions, and now it was even worse. For 10 years, the experiment had been running on its own. There wasn't even a watcher anymore. No one was here to make sure everything worked right. No one made sure Rory was cared for. He returned his attention to the machine. What if it restarted? Rory jumped up. He had to make sure the gas wouldn't start to flow again. Because Rory didn't know how to do anything with the machine, he figured the best thing for him to do was make sure the machine wasn't connected to anything. If it wasn't hooked up to a hose, it couldn't move the gas. That makes sense, he thought. Rory hurried over to the machine. Without much trouble, he found where a giant black rubber hose was clamped to one of the sides of the machine. The mega hose led to smaller ones that snaked across the walls and led to all the gas tanks. The giant hose had to be the one that moved the gas through a system that fed into the house. Rory peered at the clamp. A screw held the clamp in place. Scanning the area around the machine, Rory spotted an open, scarred, green metal toolbox. Rummaging in it, he came up with a screwdriver. Awkwardly, because he wasn't yet used to having such large hands, Rory managed to unscrew the clamp. He removed it and pulled the black hose away from the machine. It came loose with a squelching snick. Okay, if Rory was right about the machine, it couldn't move the gas even if it started again. What now, Rory asked himself. The answer to that question was easy. Rory had to get out of this place. If he could get out, he could find someone who could help him find his real home, if he actually had one. Well, even if he didn't have a home, any place had to be better than where he was. Rory pointed his light through a narrow doorway just beyond the metal desk. This was his only option now, so he stepped through it and found himself in another corridor. Although this one wasn't lined with gas tanks or rubber hoses, it still had snakes running all over the walls. These snakes were made of metal, and they looked like electrical lines or maybe water pipes. Rory couldn't really tell. The corridor was dirtier than the last one. The corridor's pale gray walls were covered with streaks of grease, and the lines of pipes had woolly layers of dust. It smelled like a mechanic's shop. Rory remembered being in one when he'd gone with his dad to take the family van to the shop. Or did he really remember that? Rory shook off the question and kept going. As Rory picked his way through the corridor, he was nervous and jumpy, but he wasn't out and out frightened. He guessed the reason he was in total panic mode was because he felt more determined than scared. Yeah, exploring a dark and creepy place by himself wasn't any fun, but Rory knew it had to be done. He was angry, and that anger was keeping him going. He didn't think he'd find any people, either. Obviously, whoever had worked here, watching Rory be scared all the time, was no longer here. He wished they were. He'd like to give them a piece of his mind. When the corridor that Rory was in connected up with another one that led both left and right, Rory shrugged and went right. One direction was as good as any other at this point. Rory had no way of knowing where he'd find a way out. Because the concrete place had no windows, Rory couldn't tell how much time had passed as he explored. Time lost its meaning as he moved along, his head turning left and right constantly. Okay, so maybe he was a little more scared than he wanted to admit. The rooms were disturbing. One was obviously some kind of observation station. It had slanted glass walls that looked out at a darkness Rory couldn't see into. Above one of the glass walls, there was a panel of unlit colored lights. Even though the lights weren't on, Rory could see that the 4 lights were different colors. One blue, one green, one pink, and one yellow. On an adjacent glass wall, a poster of a wild-looking girl with red pigtails had the word "Celebrate" printed across the top. A darkened control panel was under the glass wall with the lights. A row of upright gas tanks lined the wall to the right of it. A series of fans were on the wall on the other side of it. What was beyond the glass walls? Suddenly afraid of what might have been lurking in the darkness, Rory ducked down below the level of the glass. He tried to reassure himself as he crouched there. It was probably just the setting of some other mean experiment. He flicked his flashlight beam toward the poster again. The pigtailed girl's wide-mouthed grin was much too toothy to be friendly. Rory quickly walked out of the room and moved on. Not long after, he'd found the observation room. Rory entered a room that looked like a big dance floor with a stage. On the stage, a metal ballerina was frozen in place with her arms above her head. She wore a purple metal skirt, the stiff kind that stuck out from her waist. Why is this here? Rory wondered as he stared at the ballerina. He shone his light around and didn't see any kind of control panel or observation booth. He did, however, see a doorway on the far side of the dance floor. Was it an exit, his way out? Rory practically ran across the big dance floor. He moved so quickly that dust swirled up around his sock-covered feet as they slapped against the dirty black and white tiled floor. The doorway led to yet another corridor, with yet another open door at the end. Maybe that was the way out. Maybe it wasn't. Stepping through the open door, Rory found himself in a room crawling with more electric wall snakes. They were the big metal cords that held bunches of smaller cords inside them. All the cords led into and out of a large metal box. A breaker box, Rory thought. His dad had, maybe, taught him about the breaker box in their house. Rory knew how to open the box and flip the switches to turn lights back on if they went out. Would it work here? Would turning on more lights help him find his way out? Rory picked his way past the tangle of electrical wires. Is it safe in here, he thought? He wasn't sure he cared. After everything he'd been put through, he just wanted to get out, at any cost. Rory opened the metal box and began flipping rows of switches. He shifted them all from left to right. Nothing happened. Rory turned away from the box and flipped off his flashlight to see if any lights had come on. He quickly turned his flashlight on again. Flipping the switches hadn't changed the surrounding darkness. Rory left the room. In the corridor, Rory didn't see any changes resulting from the switches he'd flipped. He sighed and turned left out of the electrical room. Walking forward, Rory discovered that the corridor dead-ended not too far past the big dance room, but another corridor jutted off to the right. Rory headed down it. Rory passed another right turn. This time, though, the corridor he was in continued. He decided to go to its end before he came back to check out the right turn. Rory followed the corridor until it took a hard right a little farther along. There, he found himself in another corridor that led to 2 open doorways. Checking the one on the left first, he discovered a room filled with what looked like animatronic parts. Metal arms and legs and heads and torsos were stacked on shelves along with tangles of wires and mounds of gears. Rory thought the dusty metal tables near the shelves looked like tables in doctors' offices. He didn't like doctors' offices. Probably, if his memories were real, that is. He left the room and went into the room on the opposite side of the corridor. The really big room across from the one filled with robotic parts looked like a place where people went to eat and watch shows. The room had a big stage on one end and rows of purple cloth-covered tables stretching out from the stage. The tables sat on thin, old carpet. Even in his flashlight's minimal light, Rory could see that the carpet was purple with a gold star pattern. Even with the flashlight, it was difficult to see much else in the high-ceilinged room, but Rory spotted a faded sign over the stage that read Funtime Auditorium. Deflated balloons were scattered over the tables and the carpeted floor. In the shadows of a corner not far from the doorway leading out of the room, the cracked and dusty shell of an animatronic pirate fox lay crumpled against the wall. When he spotted it, Rory let out a little yelp. The fox looked a lot like Rory's nightmare fox. This fox, though, wasn't as torn up as the nightmare fox. The black eyes were unfocused, but Rory still avoided looking at them. He hurried out of the auditorium, fighting the urge to shut the door behind him for safety's sake. Of course, there were more animatronics. The repair room suggested there were many. He shouldn't be scared of this one, even though this fox had haunted his nightmares for 10 years at least. Finding himself in yet another corridor, Rory looked left and right and tried to remember the layout of where he'd been so far. If he went right, he'd come back to the corridor that led away from the electrical room. He decided he'd go back to that corridor and retrace his steps to the hall he'd passed, the one that led off to the right. Rory got to that corridor quickly, and his exploration was even faster. That corridor was short, and it led him directly into another room. This room, Rory decided, had to be the heart of the whole place he was in. It looked to be a control room. Like the room that had circus-looking lights, this room was walled on two sides by slanted glass. This was obviously another observation station. He didn't know what had been observed, and he didn't care. He didn't care about the big, currently non-functional fan on the end of the wall between the glass walls either. The weird clown faces on the wall near the fan, and the puppets on stands atop two cabinets of metal drawers under the fan didn't interest him either. He thought the clowns were super eerie, but they were just plastic faces. What got Rory's attention as soon as he entered the room were the metal drawers. There were 6 of them, 3 in each of the 2 cabinets that flanked the massive fan. Rory rushed over to the cabinets. Maybe he'd find something in the drawers to help him get the heck out of here. For the next several minutes, Rory yanked open drawers and pawed through jangles of tools and masses of papers. At first, he didn't find anything helpful. In the 4th drawer, though, he found blueprints to what was labeled Underground Testing Facility. So that's where he was. He was underground. Even the sunshine in Rory's house hadn't been real. No wonder he'd never been able to raise the shades and look outside. Rory spread out the blueprints and leaned over them. Because Rory's mom was an interior designer, or at least he thought she was, Rory had seen architectural blueprints before. He wasn't great at picking out all their details, but he could get the general layout of a place from them. Rory studied these, and he quickly found what he was looking for: a way out. Beyond this control room, down a short hallway, there was an elevator that had to lead back up to the real world. Excited, Rory trotted out of the control room and weaved his way around it to find the little corridor that led to the elevator. In minutes, he reached a circular metal room with a grated floor and a massive ceiling fan overhead. The ceiling fan wasn't moving, and the range of Rory's flashlight wasn't long enough for Rory to see what was under the grated floor. But what he could see straight ahead of him was a set of big, smooth stainless steel elevator doors. Rory rushed forward. As he did, he noticed that this room didn't have the musty smell that the rest of the corridors and rooms had. It smelled fresher. That was a good sign, he thought. Going deeper into the room, Rory passed another network of metal electric lines and 2 posters. One poster had the image of the red pigtailed girl Rory had seen before, and the other had an image of the ballerina he'd found on the stage in the dance room. Rory barely glanced at the posters. He zeroed in on a small, square control panel to the right of the elevator. Above a keypad, a big red button promised his freedom. Rory reached the button, his fingers tingling in anticipation. He pushed it. Nothing happened. Rory stared at the elevator doors. Was it one of those silent elevators? Could have been working and he just didn't hear it? Rory waited. His heart rate picked up. His palms began to sweat. He waited some more. Still, nothing happened. Rory hit the red button again. It didn't even click. Leaning toward the control panel, Rory randomly punched buttons. He did this for a full minute. Yet again, nothing happened. Rory exhaled heavily. He shone his light into the darkness. Oh right, of course the elevator didn't work. No lights, no power. Rory groaned in disappointment. He'd been sure he'd found the way out. How could he get the elevator working? Rory pounded on the red button, but he knew he was acting like the 7-year-old he hadn't been for 10 years. He turned away from the button. He had to find a way to get the elevator working. But how? The only thing Rory could think to do was go back to the control room. He hadn't gone through the last 2 drawers after he'd found the blueprints. Maybe something in there would help him. Giving the elevator one last longing glance, Rory left the room and headed back to the control room. His plan was a long shot, but he didn't know what else to do. The 5th drawer Rory went through was no help. The 6th drawer, though, gave Rory some new hope. In that drawer, he found a small, battery-powered 2-way radio. "All right," Rory exclaimed when he spotted the gray metal radio. He knew how to use one of these. He and his friend Wade had used walkie-talkies a lot. Or, in Rory's memory they had, were his memories real? Was Wade real? At this point, Rory figured he didn't need to know what was real and what wasn't. All he needed to do was get the radio working. If the batteries were still good, please, please be good, he silently begged. He could at least try to reach Wade. If Wade was real, maybe he'd still have his radio, and if he wasn't, maybe someone else would answer Rory. Rory leaned over the radio and toggled the on switch. Static spurted out into the room. Yes, Rory pumped his fists. The radio worked. Dropping to the grated floor, Rory set the radio in his lap. He fiddled with the frequency dial, and then he keyed the mic. Rory to Wade. Come in, Wade. Over, he said into the mic. Static crackled. Rory tried again. Wade, this is Rory. Do you read? Over. More static. Then Rory heard a couple blurps of garbled voices. After another ear-jabbing stream of crackling, Rory heard what sounded like, Roar, are you there? Rory tweaked the radio settings. This is Rory. Who's there? Over. The radio spit a couple of buzzing sounds. Then Rory was able to hear a voice clearly. Rory, is that you, really? Wade? Yeah, dude, Wade shouted. Where are you? You're real? Rory asked. Huh? Wade's laugh came through the radio speaker. Sure, I'm real. How about you? It's been about 10 years. Where have you been? Rory clutched the mic so hard that the plastic dug into his palm. Where should he start? Before Rory could even try to explain what had happened to him, Wade started talking again. I'm glad I kept this old walkie-talkie, Wade said. I was going to toss it out a few years ago when Dad got me new radio, but I guess I'm sentimental or something. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It reminded me of you, and getting rid of it would be like throwing away our friendship. I never expected to ever use this thing again, though. I never ever thought I'd hear your voice coming through it, that's for sure. Wade's whoop came through the radio's speaker. Your mom and dad are gonna flip out when they find out you're alive. They were so desperate to find you, man. The police gave up the search after just a year, but your parents didn't. They hired all kinds of private detectives, and they had a website and everything. Had? Rory repeated. Wade's sigh came through the walkie-talkie speaker. It's been so long, dude, but they never stopped missing you. Rory's eyes moistened. He really did have a mom and dad who cared about him. I miss them too, Rory said. And you, Wade. Fido misses you too, Wade said. Your parents kept your room the way it always was, and Fido goes in the room every day and sniffs around. That's what your mom told me the last time I talked to her. Fido? Rory had forgotten all about Fido. He had a dog. Fido was a spaniel mix with long, silky ears. How could Rory have forgotten about Fido? Rory had been 4 years old when they'd gotten Fido as a puppy. That meant the dog was 13 now. Fido's an old dude now, Wade said as if reading Rory's mind. But he still gets around okay. Rory felt tears running down his cheeks. He wiped them away. You have a little sister now, too, Wade said. He chuckled. Well, not so little now. She's 9. A sister, Rory thought? What would it be like to have a sister? When are you coming home, Wade asked. We'll have a big party. You can meet my girlfriend. Girlfriend? Wade's laugh came from the radio speaker again. Yeah, I know we never let girls into our clubhouse, but things change. Not for me, Rory thought. Is our clubhouse still there, Rory asked. Sure is, Wade said. I kept that up too. I couldn't stand the idea of it getting torn down, just in case. Even the tire swing is still there. I can't wait to see it again, Rory said. We'll have a party in the clubhouse too, Wade said. I have so much to catch up on, Rory said. I haven't been in school all these years. I'm as dumb as a bagel. Rory remembered that Wade had always told him that bagels were a dumb breakfast food. Wade laughed loudly. That's pretty dumb, he said. He must have remembered their banter about what was good for breakfast. I can't wait to see you again, Rory said. And Mom and Dad and Fido and my room and my yard. I can't wait to meet my sister. Rory's head was filling with images of everything he'd forgotten he had and things he didn't know he had. He could see himself pushing his sister on the tire swing. Maybe he'd even let her in the clubhouse. Me neither, Wade said. So when can you get here? Rory sighed. He had to tell Wade what was going on. I don't know where I am, Wade, he said. What do you mean? Has someone been holding you prisoner? Are you okay? Rory looked at the bony hand that held the radio mic. No, he wasn't exactly okay. I'm okay enough, I guess, Rory said. I'm in an underground place. The blueprints I found said it's a testing facility. There's no one here but me now. I've been in a fake house that's been filled with a gas that made me see things that weren't there. It's all been a big experiment. Whoever set up this thing has been scaring me every night with terrifying nightmares. That's awful, dude, Wade said. Where are the people now? The ones who set it all up? I don't know, Rory said. The gas stopped this morning, and that's the only reason I found out that what I thought was real isn't. The last thing I remember was that I was still 7 years old. It totally weirded me out this morning when I saw the way I look now. Whoa, Wade said. That's heavy. I can't even imagine. Wade stopped speaking, and his mic clicked. Faint static filled the silence that followed his words. Rory wasn't sure what to say next.
Can you see anything at all that might give you a clue about where you are? Wade asked.
No, nothing, Rory said. I'm in a concrete underground place. I've looked everywhere, and nothing I've found tells me where it is.
You have to get out of there, Wade said.
Rory wanted to say duh, but he thought that would be rude. Instead he said, I've been trying to find a way out. So far, no luck.
Tell me again about what you found, Wade said.
For the next several minutes, Rory gave Wade a detailed description of the house and the concrete corridors and the rooms in the testing facility. Finally, he asked, Can you think of anything I missed? Wade was silent for a few seconds. Then his mic clicked.
I think the key to escaping is going to be in that fake house, Wade said. You said it has power, right?
Yeah, Rory said.
Okay, Wade said. If the rest of the facility doesn't have power, there must be some kind of generator keeping the house going. If you can find the generator and disconnect it, and then get it back into the facility, you might be able to power everything back up, including the elevator.
Rory sat up straight. That wasn't a bad idea. That's brilliant, he said.
I just hope it works, Wade said.
Me too, Rory said.
Too bad they can't trace these old radios, Wade said. If you had a cell phone, we could trace you.
They can do that now, Rory asked.
They can do all kinds of stuff, Wade said. As soon as we stop talking, I'll call the police and tell them everything you've told me. Maybe they can figure out a way to find you.
Rory felt a shiver of excitement at that idea. Then the excitement fizzled. How in the world could the police find an underground facility when they didn't even have a clue about where to look? No, Rory was going to get himself out of here. I'll do what you suggested, Rory said, just in case the police can't help.
Good idea.
For several seconds, they were both quiet. Then Wade said,
I wish there was something else I could do for you.
Rory did too, but he said, You've done a lot just by being there, and by giving me an idea of what to do. He took a deep breath and squeezed the mic. Now, I'd better go do it. I don't know how long I've been wandering around the facility. At night, fake night that is, the house gets... Rory stopped. He was thinking about the nightmare creatures. Shaking off a shiver, he said, I need to find that generator soon.
Yeah, you'd better get going, Wade said.
Okay, Rory said.
Let me know how it goes, Wade said. I'll be here.
Thanks, I will. They said awkward goodbyes. Rory turned off the radio. Rory had kept his fear in control when he'd been in the concrete corridors, but as soon as he crawled back into the fake house, his fear turned big and ugly and made him want to curl up into a ball and cry. The great room shades were dark. Real or not, the sun was down. What time was it? Rory wasn't sure. It might be close to midnight. That's when the hidden creatures were going to come to life. Rory needed to find the generator and get out of the house before that happened. Even though it made no sense, Rory was still terrified of the creatures. Knowing they were nothing but motorized mannequins didn't take away his terror. He guessed that after so many years, the dread was too much a part of him to go away that quickly. Rory stood next to the kitchen island and thought hard. The refrigerator hummed softly as he tried to figure out how to go about finding the generator. The hum helped him think. He liked the steady purr. Without that sound, the house would have been way too silent. Rory didn't like the silence. Too much silence reminded him of how alone he was. When he thought about how alone he was, he couldn't think about anything else. Come on, he urged himself. Figure it out. Rory had already searched the whole house, and he hadn't seen a generator. Where hadn't he looked? Rory thought about the creatures in the closets at the end of the halls. When he'd found them, he hadn't gotten too close to them. Could a generator be tucked behind the monster bunny or monster chick? Rory shuddered. He didn't really want to go look behind the creatures that had tortured him through so many long, miserable nights, but he had to. Straightening his shoulders, Rory left the kitchen and headed down the right hall. I can do this, he told himself as he walked toward the closed door at the end of the hall. They're just machines, Rory said out loud when he was just a few feet from the door. That's when the closet door opened. The click of the door unlatching was loud in the silent house. It froze Rory in place. His heart leaped up into his mouth. Rory watched the closet door swing open, opening farther and farther and farther. Rory's gaze was latched onto the door, but his attention shifted when he saw movement beyond the door. A grinding whir filled the hallway, and the ratty yellow chick-like creature began moving. Rory's nightmare was coming to life. Rory's throat tightened, his legs suddenly felt rubbery, and he shifted his feet to keep his balance. When his feet moved, Rory felt the hard metal of the railing in the floor. He looked down. It's just a mechanical monster, he said aloud. Lifting his gaze, Rory looked ahead at the holy yellow chick. You're not real, he said to it. The chick didn't reply, of course. It couldn't. It was a machine. Feeling stronger now, Rory widened his stance and faced the chick. Up close, he could see how fake it really was, as it glided out of the closet and down the hall toward Rory. Rory once again shifted his gaze to the floor. He could clearly see that the chick's feet were attached to rollers that skimmed along on railings fangs set into the floor. "You can't hurt me," Rory said to the chick. Again, the chick did nothing but what its machine programming told it to do. It rolled forward along the railing until the railing curved toward Rory's bedroom. The chick's metal feet clanked against the railing, and the chick disappeared into Rory's bedroom. Rory rubbed his arms. Even though he'd now seen the machinery working, he still felt nervous being so near to one of the creatures from his nightmares. "Just get on with it," Rory told himself. Rushing forward, Rory checked out the now empty closet to see if it held a generator. It didn't. Back in the kitchen, Rory looked around. He checked out the other creature closet too, the one on the end of the left hallway. By the time he did, Purple Blue Bunny had rolled into his room. The bunny's closet wasn't hiding a generator either. Where else could Rory look? When Rory's gaze landed on the island's cabinet, he realized that he couldn't even remember opening it. He turned and looked around at the rest of the kitchen. Had he ever gotten anything out of any cabinets? He opened the one drawer to get the flashlight, but he couldn't remember opening anything else. Rory looked over at the sink. His small glass sat there near the tap. That was the only glass he could even remember using. He never used plates, and he always got his food from the fridge. What if... Rory looked down. The largest cabinet in the kitchen was the one in front of him. Was it big enough to hide a generator? Rory dropped to his knees. The floor felt gritty beneath his bare skin, and the dust puffed up around him as he scooted closer to the cabinet. Could it be that easy, he asked himself? Rory grasped the cabinet's gray handles. He pulled the cabinet doors open, and his heart sank. No generator. The only thing behind the cabinets was thick gray rubber. The rubber surface was uneven. It reminded Rory of waffles. Rory started to stand so that he could check the other cabinets, but he paused and cocked his head. His ears were telling him something. What was it? Rory held his breath and listened. All he could hear was the refrigerator's hum. Why was that important? Turning to look at the fridge, Rory wondered if the generator was in the fridge, maybe in the part that was supposed to be a freezer. He once again started to stand, but as soon as he did, he realized what his ears were telling him. The rumbling purr that he'd thought was the fridge wasn't actually coming from the fridge. Why had he never noticed that before? It made no sense now that he thought about it. The fridge wasn't a real fridge. The inside of it was just a dispenser. It wasn't cold, so why would it need a motor? No, the motor Rory could hear wasn't in the fridge. Rory leaned forward toward the lumpy gray rubber. He sucked in a quick breath of surprise. The motor sound was coming from behind the rubber. Rory reached out and put his palms against the rubber. He began running his hands over it, searching for a seam or something he could grab onto. It took only seconds for Rory's fingers to slip into a slight gap between some of the waffle-like dimples in the rubber. He dug the tips of his fingers farther into the gaps so he could grip the rubber. Once he had a good hold on it, he pulled it toward him. At first, the rubber didn't give, but when Rory leaned away from the island, yanking hard, the rubber made a squishy crunching sound and tore loose. Immediately, the growl of an engine filled the kitchen. Rory fell back on his butt, a big chunk of gray rubber clutched in his fists. Tossing aside the rubber, Rory looked into the island cabinet, right at a faded orange generator. The generator was vibrating. It was chugging along steadily. Rory looked at the rubber. It was soundproofing, he realized. The rubber had muffled the generator's motor, and for some reason it had made it seem like the sound was coming from the fridge. Or maybe it was the hallucinogenic gas that had done that. Rory had misinterpreted everything about his life for years and years. It wasn't a surprise he'd never pinpointed the motor's sound during that time. Rory immediately shifted back to his knees and studied the droning machine. The generator wasn't big, maybe 3 by 2.5 feet. It was probably heavy though. Rory reached for its metal frame and started to tug on it. Yes, it was heavy, very heavy. It didn't budge. Rory, however, was determined. He repositioned his knees and got a better grip on the frame. He started to pull on it again, this time letting out a metallic groan. The generator scooted forward a couple inches.
"Hello, Rory."
Rory snatched his hands back from the generator frame and dropped his head back up to look at the ceiling. The voice he'd just heard came from above him. Was someone here after all? Was someone watching him?
"Please don't disturb the generator, Rory," the voice said.
Rory immediately spotted a large white speaker on the ceiling above him. Tucked between 2 gray metal light fixtures, the speaker blended right into the white painted ceiling. That must have been why Rory had never seen it before. That and the fact that the gas he'd been inhaling had been making him see things that weren't there, and not seeing things that were there. "Who are you?" Rory asked the voice.
"The generator is what keeps everything running, Rory," the voice said. "It's taking care of you."
The voice coming from the speaker was a man's voice. Maybe a man about Rory's dad's age. It was a very nice voice. The voice was low and smooth. It was calm and soothing.
"You know you want to be here, Rory," the voice said, "and the generator makes it possible for you to stay here. It's hooked up to a steady supply of gas, Rory. Always there for you."
"Why can't I see you?" Rory asked. If someone was here, Rory wanted to see them face to face. Why would the man talking to him stay hidden? Why didn't the man come out to talk to him when Rory was wandering through all the concrete corridors? Why didn't the man ever spend time with Rory?
You ran away from home, the voice said. Don't you remember?
Rory pushed his hair out of his face as he concentrated on what the voice was saying. I ran away, he thought?
You didn't fit in at school, Rory, the voice said.
Rory's questions suddenly didn't feel important. Even though Rory couldn't see who was speaking, the sound of the voice felt like a warm hug. He closed his eyes, and in his mind, he could see a reassuring smile.
You had so much trouble in class, Rory, the voice said. You couldn't understand the equations in math. You had trouble with your reading.
Rory frowned. Yes, he remembered that now. He hated school. He felt stupid when he was at school. He felt like he was wrong somehow, like he couldn't get anything right. He felt like an outcast at school. Wade was his only friend.
And the girls, Rory, the voice continued. Remember how the girls thought you were wimpy?
Rory hunched his shoulders. He remembered that now, too. That was why he and Wade had built their clubhouse. Girls didn't like Wade either, so they'd built a place where girls weren't allowed. Not that any girls wanted to be there, but the small wood sign that had "No Girls" etched onto its surface made Rory and Wade feel like it was their choice not to have girls around.
You came here because you knew you'd be taken care of here, the voice said. You have been taken care of here. Here, you've never been an outcast. You're never wrong. You've been watched over and cared for. That was something your parents never did, Rory, remember?
Rory bunched up his fists. Yes, he remembered. All his parents ever did was work. His dad was never home. His mom was gone most of the time too, and when she was home, all she ever did was tell him how wrong he was. Don't leave smudges, Rory. Pick up your clothes, Rory. Make your bed, Rory. Comb your hair, Rory. It's a mess. Rory's mom cared more about how things looked than she did about her own son.
You're safe here, Rory, the voice said. This is your home. You've been watched over here. You've never been abandoned. Never left alone. All these years you've been cared for. Because you're special, Rory, and you deserve to live in this special place. Safe and secure. Never alone. This is your home.
Rory hugged himself and started rocking back and forth. He stared at the generator. Rory thought about talking to Wade over the radio. He thought about what Wade had said. Wade had said Rory's parents missed him. That made Rory feel good. Rory really loved the idea of going home and seeing his room in the clubhouse. He wanted to pet Fido and meet his sister. Rory stiffened. What if his sister didn't like him? Why would she? No one besides Wade had liked Rory when he was little. That was the whole reason he'd run away to begin with. He'd never been able to be what people wanted him to be. He'd always come up short. He'd never did anything the way anyone wanted. Not his parents, not his teachers, not the other kids in the class. Why would it be any different now? Rory hated feeling so left out. He'd always felt so wrong. He hated the feeling of being made fun of. He hated feeling stupid. Did Rory really want to go back to a world where he didn't fit in? It had been 10 years. He hadn't learned anything in that time. He'd be so far behind. He'd be even more of an outcast than he had been before. All he'd ever do was let people down. All he'd ever be was lonely. Rory's eyes welled up and tears began streaming down his face. No, Rory couldn't go home. This place, no matter how fake, was now the only home where he fit in. Letting his tears flow, Rory reached out and picked up the gray, waffled rubber. He reset the rubber against the front of the generator, pressing hard to be sure it stayed. Then he closed the island cabinet door. Rory sniffled and stood, pushing aside the images of an outside world that he now knew he could never return to. Rory turned and faced the refrigerator. Wiping his face, Rory took a deep breath. Then he crawled back through the vent-like tunnel that led out behind the fridge. Dropping to the concrete floor of the rubber hose-lined corridor, he walked past all the gas tanks until he reached an old gray machine. Stiffly, Rory reached into the toolbox and found the screwdriver he'd used to unclamp the main hose that led from the machine. Rory faced the machine, refit the hose, and screwed the clamp tight again. He stepped back and studied the machine. When he'd looked at the machine before, Rory hadn't a clue as to why it had stopped running, but now he could easily see that its power cord was loose. Rory pushed the cord back into its socket, and the machine roared to life. Settling into a buzzing hum, the machine vibrated, and the rubber hose that connected to all the gas tanks flexed and went rigid. The gas was flowing again. Rory wormed his way back through the metal door at the rear of the fake fridge. He squirmed forward until he could put his feet on the kitchen floor. Once he was upright, he bent over and picked up the discarded wafer dispenser. Then he turned to clamp it back into place. He replaced all the faded yellow packets. As he lined them up, he realized how tired he was. He was so drowsy. He could barely keep his eyes open. Closing the refrigerator door, Rory rubbed his forehead. Why was he standing in front of the fridge? It was late. Rory turned and looked at the dark window shades in the great room. It was really late. He should be in bed. Rory's gaze landed on his red backpack. He frowned. Hadn't he gone to school today? He chewed on the inside of his cheek. He couldn't remember. Rory sighed and shrugged. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he needed to get in bed. Rory left the great room and started scampering down the long left side hall, eager to get to his room. His hand trailed along the curved wood chair rail as he went. Pausing by the bathroom door, Rory canted his head and tried to remember whether he'd brushed his teeth already. He was pretty sure he had, so why had he been in the kitchen? Rory shrugged again. Whatever, he was so tired, he just wanted to be in bed. Rory trotted into his bedroom and shut the door behind him. Crossing to the other door on the right side of the room, he closed it too. Then he made sure his closet doors were closed. Rory yawned loudly and turned to look at his nice, cushy quilt. It looked so fresh and clean and inviting. Rory dashed to his bed and dove under his covers. Glancing at his red alarm clock, Rory saw that it was well after midnight. Knowing it was so late made Rory shiver, so he snuggled down into his nice, warm bed. Pulling his quilt up over his head, he closed his eyes. At the end of the concrete corridor filled with gas tanks, the gas pump rumbled steadily. In the ceiling above the pump, behind a metal grate, a tape recorder clicked. It then whirred loudly, the sound of a cassette rewinding. Another click. The cassette was once again ready for the next time Rory wandered too far.